A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Muda. Learn more at modal.com.
It is funny how we were promised that by March 2026, the massive influx of generative agents and autonomous workflows would basically turn the 40-hour workweek into a polite suggestion. Instead, here we are on March 14th. And if you look at the recent Boston Consulting Group study from earlier this month, the reality is the complete opposite. AI hasn't actually cleared our plates. It has just made the plates larger and piled the food higher. Tech workers are reporting higher burnout rates now than they were 2 years ago because the speed of the tools has just increased the expectations for the output. We are trapped in what the industry is calling the AI paradox.
My name is Korn, and I have been obsessed with that specific BCG study, Armin. It found that in high-tech firms, these efficiency tools are actually increasing the cognitive load because we are spending all our saved time managing the sprawl of the AI output rather than actually doing deep work. We have the fastest tools in history, yet we feel more behind than ever. It is like we are trying to outrun a treadmill that keeps accelerating. We are seeing 55% of the United States workforce reporting burnout as of late 2025, according to the Eagle Hill report. And the irony is that high achievers, the people listening to this show, are often the ones most resistant to the very thing that would save them.
Today's prompt from Daniel is about how to actually break that cycle, and he's pointing us toward a philosophy that feels almost countercultural in this high-speed environment, which is Kaizen. Daniel's asking us to look at how we can replace these unsustainable big effort sprints with a more technical, incremental framework for productivity. We are biologically wired to crave the big win, the all-nighter, the heroic effort that saves the project. We want kaikaku, which is the Japanese term for radical, revolutionary change. We want the total system overhaul. But the reality of 2026 is that system overhauls are exhausting and usually lead to a massive crash.
It is the perfect time for this. We are addicted to the dopamine hit of the big win. We love the narrative of the hero who stays up for 72 hours to ship the version 1.0. But that is essentially technical debt for your biology. You are borrowing energy from tomorrow at a high interest rate. Kaizen, which most people think of as just a buzzword for small steps, actually has a very rigorous engineering-focused history that we need to reclaim. It wasn't originally a self-help concept. It was a survival strategy for industry.
You have to go back to post-World War II Japan to see where this really started. You had figures like W. Edwards Deming, an American statistician, going over to Japan because the United States wasn't really listening to his quality control theories at the time. He teamed up with people like Taiichi Ohno at Toyota. Ohno is essentially the father of the Toyota production system. They didn't have the resources to do radical, expensive overhauls, so they had to optimize the system they had from the inside out, one tiny piece at a time. This is where the distinction between Kaizen and Kaikaku becomes vital. Kaikaku is the revolution, Kaizen is the evolution. And in a world where the underlying technology is changing every 2 weeks, you cannot survive on a diet of constant revolution.
That is a crucial distinction. Kaizen isn't about working less. It is about optimizing the system so that the work you do actually counts. Masaaki Imai, who really popularized this in the West in the 80s, defined it as ongoing improvement involving everyone. In a personal productivity context, that means every part of your day is subject to iterative refinement. But I want to talk about why this is so hard for people like us. Why do we feel like we are failing if we aren't doing something big and dramatic? It is the visibility of the effort. We equate suffering with value.
If I tell you I spent 15 minutes today refining the way I filter my incoming data streams, it doesn't feel like a win. If I tell you I stayed up until 4 in the morning refactoring a whole code base, I feel like a hero. But if you look at the math, the hero approach is actually less efficient. This is where the 1% principle comes in. If you improve something by just 1% every day, you don't end up 36% better at the end of the year. The math is 1.01 to the power of 365, which equals 37.78. You are nearly 38 times better.
That exponential growth is what people miss. We think progress is linear, so we think a small step today results in a small gain tomorrow. But because these improvements compound, the small step today is actually the foundation for a much larger gain 6 months from now. It is like interest in a bank account. But to get there, we have to talk about Muda. Muda is the Japanese word for waste. In the Toyota production system, identifying Muda was the first step to Kaizen. Taiichi Ohno identified 7 types of waste in manufacturing, but if we translate that to knowledge work in 2026, it looks very different.
Let's actually break down those 7 wastes for a modern tech worker. First, there is overproduction. In 2026, that is generating 10,000 words of AI content when you only needed a 200-word summary. Then there is waiting. That is waiting for a slow build process or waiting for a response on a Slack thread. There is transport, which is moving data between 5 different apps because your workflow isn't integrated. There is extra processing, which is over-polishing a document that no one is going to read in depth. There is inventory, which is that backlog of 300 unread newsletters and browser tabs. There is motion, which is the physical and digital context switching between your IDE, your browser, and your communication tools. And finally, there are defects, which are the bugs and errors caused by rushing to meet an arbitrary deadline.
Think about how many times you open a browser tab, forget why you were there, and then go back to your IDE. That is motion and waiting combined. It is a resource-consuming activity that adds 0 value to the end product. I think the biggest Muda in the modern workplace is the notification loop. We have these sophisticated AI agents now that are supposed to be helping us, but they often generate more noise. I was looking at a workflow last week where a developer had set up an autonomous agent to summarize their Slack channels. It sounds great, but the summary itself became another thing he had to read and manage. He had added a layer of Muda to solve a problem of Muda.
And that is where the 5 whys come in. This is one of Taiichi Ohno's most famous tools for root cause analysis. When you encounter a bottleneck or a failure in your productivity, you don't just fix the surface symptom. You ask why 5 times. Let's walk through a real-world example for someone listening. Corn, let's say I missed my deep work window today. Why?
Because you got distracted by a Slack thread about a minor bug.
Okay, why did I get distracted by that thread?
Because you felt the need to respond immediately to show you were on top of it.
Why did I feel that need to show I was on top of it?
Because you haven't set clear expectations with your team about your focus hours, so you feel like silence is interpreted as laziness.
Why haven't I set those expectations?
Because you are worried that if you aren't constantly available, you will be seen as less valuable than the AI agents that are always on.
And why am I worried about being less valuable than the AI?
Because our current team culture values presence and speed of response over the actual quality and depth of the output.
That 5th why is where the real Kaizen happens. You realize the problem isn't your lack of willpower or your notification settings, it is a cultural or psychological misalignment regarding your value in an AI-driven workplace. Fixing the notification settings is a temporary patch. Addressing the team culture or your own anxiety about being seen as productive is a system optimization. It is much harder to do that kind of honest reflection though. In Japan, they call this Hansei.
Hansei is a word that doesn't have a perfect English equivalent, but it means non-defensive self-reflection. In Western culture, when something goes wrong, we either blame someone else or we fall into a shame spiral where we beat ourselves up. Neither of those is Hansei. Hansei is looking at the failure with the clinical detachment of an engineer looking at a broken machine. You aren't a bad person because you wasted 3 hours on YouTube, but your system clearly has a vulnerability that allowed that to happen.
I love that framing. It removes the moral weight from productivity. If you look at our past discussion in episode 453, we talked about the psychological toll of long-term crisis and how we need to find rest. Hansei is the bridge to that because it allows you to stop the self-flagellation. If you can look at your day and say, this specific part of my workflow is Muda, you can change it without feeling like you need to change your entire personality. It is a system health check, not a character judgment.
And that leads directly into the idea of friction reduction. Most high achievers try to power through friction with sheer willpower. They think, I just need to be more disciplined. But willpower is a finite cognitive resource. It is like a battery that drains throughout the day. Kaizen says, don't use the battery, use the system design. If you find yourself struggling to start a specific task, don't tell yourself to try harder. Look at the friction. Is the documentation for that task buried in a subfolder? Is the environment not set up? Is the first step too vague?
It is the James Clear approach from Atomic Habits, but applied with the rigor of an industrial engineer. If you want to make a behavior easier, you reduce the number of steps required to start it. If you want to stop a bad habit, you increase the friction. In 2026, this often means literally uninstalling apps or using hardware-level blocks on certain domains during work hours. It is about making the right action the path of least resistance. I have been applying this to my own research process. I used to have this big effort goal where I would say, I am going to read 5 white papers this weekend. And of course, Saturday would roll around, I would feel overwhelmed by the sheer volume of text, and I would end up reading 0.
So how did you Kaizen that?
My Kaizen goal is now just to open one paper and read the abstract. That is it. That is the micro goal. Because the friction of reading an abstract is almost 0, I actually do it. And once I have started, the momentum usually carries me through the rest of the paper. That momentum is key. We often talk about the cold start problem in computing, and humans have it too. The energy required to start a task is significantly higher than the energy required to maintain it. By breaking things into what Daniel calls micro goals, you are essentially reducing the voltage required to trigger the start of the circuit.
It also helps with energy management versus time management. We are still so obsessed with the clock. We think in terms of 8-hour days or 60-minute meetings. But our cognitive load doesn't work that way. We have peaks and valleys of mental energy, often tied to our ultradian rhythms. A Kaizen approach to energy management means observing those patterns and matching the complexity of the task to your current state. If I am in a low-energy valley at 2 in the afternoon, trying to do deep architectural work is Muda. I am going to produce low-quality work that I will have to refactor later. It is much more efficient to do low-cognition tasks during those times, like clearing out my physical workspace or doing basic administrative filing.
This connects back to episode 652, where we talked about the art of the hopeful pause and how AI reasoning models are now performing at this doctoral level. We mentioned then that human logic has limits that AI doesn't, but humans have an intuition for system optimization that AI still struggles with. We can see the interconnectedness of our physical environment, our emotional state, and our technical output. An AI can optimize a schedule based on time, but it can't tell that you are feeling burnt out because you haven't had a real conversation with a human in 3 days.
That is a great point. A Kaizen approach to your life involves looking at those non-technical inputs. Maybe the reason your productivity is dropping is that your office lighting is terrible or you are dehydrated. These sound like trivial things, but in the aggregate, they are the 1% improvements that lead to that 38 times growth. I want to dig into the identification side of this. How does someone actually start auditing their day for Muda without it becoming another massive task that leads to burnout? Because if I tell someone, hey, go audit every minute of your day, that sounds like a lot of work.
You don't audit every minute. You look for the pain points. Taiichi Ono used to draw a chalk circle on the factory floor and make his managers stand in it for hours just watching the assembly line. He wanted them to see the reality of the work, not the reports. You can do a digital version of this. Pick 1 hour of your day and just pay hyper attention to where your focus goes. Don't try to change anything, just observe. You will be shocked at how much Muda you find. You will see yourself hovering over an icon or waiting for a slow build process or rereading the same email 4 times because you are distracted.
The build process is a classic one. I know so many developers who just accept a 3-minute build time as a fact of life. They use that 3 minutes to check social media, which then derails their focus for 20 minutes. A Kaizen approach would be to spend a week doing nothing but optimizing that build process down to 30 seconds. It feels like you aren't doing real work, because you aren't shipping features, but you are removing a massive source of Muda that was poisoning your entire day. This is the difference between being a lumberjack who is too busy sawing to stop and sharpen the saw, and one who understands that a sharp saw is the only way to finish the job.
Kaizen is the act of stopping to sharpen the saw, but doing it in tiny increments so you never actually stop the production line. It also requires a complete reframing of perfectionism. High achievers often use perfectionism as a shield. They think if it isn't perfect, it isn't worth doing. But Kaizen says that perfect is the enemy of improved. If I can make a process 2% better today, that is a victory. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be better than it was yesterday. This is especially important in 2026, where the sheer volume of information makes perfection impossible. You have to settle for iterative excellence.
I love that term, iterative excellence. It reminds me of the way we handle software deployments now. We don't do these massive once-a-year releases anymore. We do continuous integration and continuous deployment. We are shipping small changes constantly. Kaizen is just applying CI/CD to your life. You are constantly deploying small updates to your habits, your environment, and your workflows. Let's talk about habit modification. A lot of people try to quit a bad habit cold turkey. They say, I'm never going to check my phone in the morning again. That is a kaikaku approach, a radical change, and it usually fails because the friction is too high.
How does Kaizen handle habit change? Small substitutions. Instead of saying, I won't check my phone, you say, I will drink a glass of water before I check my phone. You are adding a tiny positive friction point. Or you move the phone to a different room. You aren't banning the behavior, you are just slightly increasing the cost of it. Over time, that tiny bit of friction makes the habit less attractive. It is about steering the ship by 1 degree rather than trying to do a 180-degree turn in the middle of a storm.
This also applies to how we learn new things. We are in an era where we have to constantly upskill because the AI landscape changes every 2 weeks. If you try to spend every weekend doing a 10-hour deep dive into a new framework, you will burn out. But if you spend 15 minutes every morning reading the documentation for one new function, you are actually going to retain more and stay ahead of the curve without the stress. It is the difference between a flood and a steady drip. A flood causes erosion and damage. A steady drip can carve a canyon through solid rock. But you have to have the patience to trust the drip.
And that is the hardest part for high achievers. We want the canyon today. We don't want to wait for the erosion to happen over time. I think that is where the Hansei, the reflection, becomes so important. You need a way to see that the drip is working. If you don't track your small wins, you will feel like you aren't making progress. I started keeping a very simple log. Not a complex project management system, just a text file where I write down one thing I optimized today. Some days it is just, I remapped a keyboard shortcut for a common command. It sounds tiny, but seeing that list grow over a month gives me the psychological proof that the system is working.
It turns productivity into a game of marginal gains. You start looking for them everywhere. You realize that if you can save 10 seconds on a task you do 50 times a day, you have just bought yourself nearly 10 minutes of free time. Do that across 10 different tasks, and you have an extra hour and a half every day. That is not magic, it is just basic arithmetic, but it feels like magic when you actually have that hour back. Let's get into the practical takeaways for the listeners. If someone is listening to this and they're in that burnout cycle, they're working 60 hours a week, they're using all the AI tools but feeling further behind, what is the first step?
The first step is the micro-goal protocol. Take one task that has been hanging over your head, something that you think will take 4 hours, and find the 15-minute version of it. Don't try to do the 4-hour task. Just do the 15-minute iteration. If it is a report, just write the outline. If it is a bug, just reproduce it and write down the steps. The goal is to lower the barrier to entry until it is impossible to say no. You are essentially tricking your brain into bypassing the resistance that comes with big effort. Thinking.
I would add to that the Muda audit. Just for 1 hour today, keep a notepad next to you, and every time you feel that tiny flash of frustration or distraction, write down what caused it. Don't try to fix it yet. Just identify the waste. Usually, we are so used to the Muda that we don't even see it anymore. We think it is just part of the job, but once you write it down, it becomes a target for optimization. Maybe it is a slow loading app, or a repetitive data entry task, or a colleague who always calls instead of emailing. Identify it first.
And then, tonight, do a 5-minute Hansei session. Look at your day and ask, what was the biggest source of waste today? And then ask why 5 times. Get to that root cause. Is it a technical issue? Is it a boundary issue? Is it an emotional issue? Once you have the root cause, you can design a 1% improvement for tomorrow. Not a total fix, just a 1% improvement. If the problem is that you are distracted by news sites, the 1% improvement isn't, I will never read the news again. It is, I will move the news app to the last page of my home screen.
I think the most important takeaway is the perfectionism reframe. We have to move from perfect but exhausting to good enough and improve daily. In the current market, sustainability is actually a competitive advantage. If you can keep producing high-quality work at a steady pace while everyone else is crashing and burning in these big effort cycles, you are going to win in the long run. It is the tortoise and the hare, but the tortoise has a turbocharger that only kicks in after a year of consistent effort.
We have to stop seeing rest and optimization as things we do when the work is finished. They are the work. Optimizing the system is just as important as the output the system produces. If you ignore the system, it will eventually break, and no amount of AI tools will be able to fix it once your own cognitive health is compromised. This has been a really grounding discussion. I think we all need that reminder that we don't have to be heroes every day. We just have to be slightly better than we were yesterday. It is a much more humane way to live and work, especially in a world that is moving as fast as ours is in 2026.
It really is. And it is something we see reflected in the way the most successful people we know operate. They aren't necessarily the ones working the most hours. They are the ones with the most refined systems. They have eliminated the Muda so they can focus on the things that actually move the needle. They aren't running faster, they are just running with less friction.
If you found this helpful, I really recommend checking out episode 453 on finding rest amidst crisis. It provides a lot of the emotional context for why we struggle to stop these big effort cycles in the first place. And if you want to see how this connects to the broader tech landscape, episode 652 on the AI paradox is a great companion piece to this one. It explains why more tools often lead to more work and how to avoid that trap.
Big thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a huge thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. It is their infrastructure that allows us to do these deep dives every week without our own systems crashing.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach new listeners who might be struggling with these same burnout cycles. It is a small 1% action you can take right now to help the show grow.
You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe. We will be back next week with another prompt to explore.
Until then, find your 1% improvement.
See you then.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our